We have Jang Man-chul from Korea Martial Arts Association, the president Jang Man-chul. Please give a big round of applause to Mr. Jang Man-chul. Next, we'll begin the second session of UNESCO ICM International Symposium. Along with UNESCO ICM and the APAC Center, Living Heritage Martial Arts was released. So we will honor the release of such book. So we will have two main presentations followed by discussion. First, Song Yong-bak, a Assistant Director General of ICSCAP and Director, will give his presentation. Please give a big round of applause.
Nice to see you all. Our center is located in Jeonju. So I spent a lot of the time to come here from the early morning. And first of all, I'd like to express the gratitude for inviting me here to this meaningful event. Now we are here at this beautiful and wonderful venue, which was newly constructed by the UNESCO ICM. So it's also a meaningful event at this new venue. Last year, between ICSCAP and UNESCO ICM as Category 2 institutions under UNESCO, we have done discussions on the co-project, and today I'm going to share with you the result of those discussions between ICSCAP and UNESCO ICM. First of all, let me provide you with the presentation title with the efforts in building visibility for intangible cultural heritage. In terms of the intangible cultural heritage, let me share with you the ideas and discussions along with the perspectives. In this regard, I would like to also give you the ideas and overviews on the brochures published as well regarding the relevant topics, as I mentioned just before. So today, I'd like to share with you the publishment of those brochures and the reference materials throughout the presentation today. How can I press the next button? Okay, thank you. Our organization, ICSCAP ICHCAP, is managing Asia-Pacific member countries to protect the intangible cultural heritage. We are also supporting the activities for the 48 UNESCO Asia-Pacific member countries, and we have running our operation since 2011 for the past 9 years. Our main functions is to provide information and networking activities. We have also a lot of the joint partners as well. If you look at the map here, we have the centers as Category 2, especially among Korea, China, and Japan. Each center is located in the 3 countries. In terms of the national identity, and if we look at the expand perspective towards the cultural diversity, in that regard, we are going to consider the characteristics, a lot of the circumstances in the region's competitiveness, as well as the ethnic groups for the further cooperation. We have also done our first steps ahead of other countries, China and Japan, and the 2 countries, China and Japan, are also following the of Korea. These are the functions categorized among the three countries. In terms of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Center, so China is focusing the training and education. Korea Center is mainly focusing on the networking and information sharing, while Japan is focusing on research areas. As early member under the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Center, we had first of all very broad range of work, but we also had to have more specify the scope of work in the beginning stage. And now we are seeing such a very meaningful event like today. So unlike other centers, our center ISCAP is one of the front runner in the fields. In terms of our project, we have a number of projects, but rather than just explain all in detail, let me also highlight some of the key projects. First of all, to establish the information sharing mechanisms. For example, we also do the digitalization of the data and information for the intangible cultural heritage, as well as the making the video clips for the promotions as well. We also have a lot of the networking related discussions and the meetings to establish, have more the coordinations and the meetings along with the experts. Indeed, we also published the books as well as the relevant materials as well. In more specific, in terms of the information sharing mechanisms based on ICT, these are the projects that we are doing at this point of the time. As we are supporting the 48 Asia-Pacific member countries, I think that we have more countries that are requiring for the further support, like ODA. For our member countries, we are also doing the digitalization on the archives and the data records, as well as the making video clips as well for establishing the network and the data. In terms of the ICH networks, I think that this is one of the strongest capabilities for the 5 sub-regions, for example, Asia-Pacific region, or the Southeast Asia, or West Asia, and Middle East. For the sub-5 categories and the regions, in the Asia-Pacific, we have also conducted about the 10-year project to support those sub-regions in the Asia-Pacific region. We have also done a lot of the project as well. And for example, last year, the former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, was also participated in the World Intangible Cultural Heritage Forum hosted in last year, 2019. We have also hosted this year's forum as well, very recently, via the online platform and virtual meeting. And we had a lot of the number of participants joining on the online platform to expand the more repetitions around the world, I guess. To build awareness on the visibilities, we also published some of the magazines and the relevant materials as well. You can also see the English version, the brochures as well. We have started publishing those ICH career for the past 10 years. We are also awarded, we were awarded as a gold medal prize for, in the fields of intangible cultural heritage, that we have built very high level of the quality in terms of the magazines and the intangible cultural heritage. For example, for the promotional materials and the papers for the intangible cultural heritage are also a lot of the examples that we have published so far. Regarding Living Heritage Series project, we have 2 categories, and we are doing annual publishment since 2017. The theme of the 2017 was the traditional core. 2018 was talking rituals, and for this year, the theme was traditional martial arts, along with the UNESCO ICM. For the years in odd numbers, we have conducted the joint project with NGOs as well. And to select the publishers, we conduct the tender as well to select some of the publishing companies, including the partners as well as relevant authorities and agencies. So for the years in odd number, the NGOs' participation, or probably from the perspective of NGOs, we have induced a lot of participation from NGOs to support NGOs for the further collaborations. These are one of the key elements that we are focusing on. In terms of the talking rituals and games or traditional sports, we also do a lot of the collaborations with international organizations as well. So upon the partnership with international organizations, we have done a lot of the activities. And for the theme of next year, we will publish about the traditional musical instruments. Not only that, there are a lot of the processes until that we finish publishing those materials in academic papers. But once we publish those materials and academic papers, we conduct the ceremony as well. And ICH NZO Forum is also hosted to promote the traditional martial arts or traditional food as a themes of the forum. So in this regard, a lot of the countries are participating in those forums for joint seminars. And we have done a lot of the successful cases. And for today, like in the midst of the COVID-19, we also expected very few participants for today's seminar, but I really sincerely appreciate your participation as we see a lot of participants more than expected. For today's seminar, I believe that as one of the examples of the legacy, along with the Living Heritage Series project, this seminar will be also one of the very meaningful and important events in that regard. For the intangible cultural heritage is defined like these sentences: to encounter such the phenomenon of the urbanizations and globalization, cultural diversity is maintained, cultural harmonization, cultural relativity, as well as intercultural dialogue are understood and led as one of the key elements for human beings under the definitions of the intangible cultural heritage. As of the 2003, in accordance with the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, the objectives of the convention is to respect intangible cultural heritage owned by communities, groups, and individuals as well for seeking further cooperation. For intangible cultural heritage, as you can see here in a broad spectrum of definitions itself, you can see, for example, in terms of the expressions or drives, knowledge, technologies, as well as the customs, can also deliver those intangible cultural heritage in the forms of the tools, objects, and artifacts, as well as the cultural spaces. Can you also see the 5 key elements as the scope of intangible cultural heritage? For some cases, can also add some more elements as combinations, or we can eliminate one of these elements in terms of the circumstances. First of all, like the verbal traditional languages or performing arts and festivals, including rituals and the social customs, as well as the knowledge and the traditional martial arts as well. You can also refer to a lot of activities in terms of safeguarding the intangible cultural heritage in accordance with the 23 Convention. And these are also very highlighted activities. In addition to protect those principles, can refer to the values and hierarchy to safeguard the intangible cultural heritage as stipulated here. In here, there could be the relative priority on these key categories depending on the circumstances in the regions and countries, of course, for the intercultural dialogues or interactions. We are trying to facilitate those values and principles. And I'm sure that you have also got the recent edition of this Living Heritage series. The English version was earlier than the Korean version. And the main title is Traditional Martial Arts, and subtitle is As Intangible Cultural Heritage. And indeed, it's available in English and along with the UNESCO ICM in Korean version. Is also under process of the publishment by the 학고제, is one of the Korean publishing company. On the way here, I also reviewed the Korean versions as well. So the contents were really outstanding, I believe. These are the processes throughout the publication. From the early beginning of this year, we have started the first stages throughout the reviews on the scripts. We have also conducted the meetings for edition. And then finally, today we will have the publication ceremony as well. Around the world, as we have done the open calls, and we have received about the 60 scripts, and a total of the 19 scripts were selected as the final round. And we have the 18 categories from the 13 countries to introduce about their traditional martial arts for our Living Heritage series. So a total of the 19 scripts are introduced in this edition. So among the 13 countries as intangible cultural heritage, traditional martial arts are introduced. For example, in India, Myanmar, Mexico, and other countries to show like wrestling and dancing are also introduced in this version. This slide shows the martial arts in Brazil. The left photo shows the traditional martial arts in Brazil. Under the colonial rule of the Portugals, the contents are introducing how some certain types of the martial arts have been introduced into Brazil of the time. If you look at the right photo, the name of the martial arts is called Bak Ho in Vietnam. By 2000s, Bak Ho was very popular, but from the 2000s, the Bak Ho is losing its popularity. So the articles have analyzed how Bak Ho got less popular depending on the analysis as well as interviews. In addition, can also refer to some of the information regarding Takken. Can also refer to the traditional martial arts, Kureshi in Kazakhstan as well. In terms of the traditional martial arts, at the third MINAPS meeting, traditional martial arts is also discussed as a key element for contributing to SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. In perspectives of the intangible cultural heritage, let me also share with you some of the key points. We also need to consider whether the intangible cultural heritage would continue its viabilities. Next, we also need to look at how cultural diversity is impacting along with the interactions as well as communications. And lastly, for understanding other countries' cultures, we also need to seek ways in contributing to further understanding on those differences in terms of the cultural aspects. In conclusion, while we are preparing for the publication of the Living Heritage series upon the partnership with the ICM, the perspectives towards traditional martial arts are specified in a different ways. But in terms of the perspectives of the intangible cultural heritage, like broad spectrum and perspectives towards the traditional martial arts are to be also considered as the virtuous cycle contributing to the sustainable development for the societies. So I think that we also need to the more utilize the possibilities leading from the traditional martial arts. Indeed, proactive involvement and cooperation are to be further encouraged as the one of the model cases. So sincerely, I'd like to look forward to your further collaborations and involvement. I think that it's the time to wrap up my presentations. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for presenting about the past perspectives and also one of the examples as the Living Heritage series in terms of the intangible cultural heritage. Thank you very much, and let's give a big hand to his great presentation. Next, we are going to join the professor of Samyuk University, Professor Sanko Louis. The professor is also going to talk about the ways and the measures for the prospering the physical health in terms of the traditional.
Good day. So, Assistant Director Park gave a beautiful overview of this whole project. And I am here to give you an example of what the project is about. I contributed one of the chapters, chapter 15, in the book, and I'm sure all of you have the book. It's in your packages that you got with registration. So today I will just give you a taste of the types of articles that you can expect in this wonderful book, beautiful collection of martial arts. One of the problems with intangible cultural heritages, such as traditional dance or traditional martial arts, is that they are intangible. Of course, this makes its preservation so much more difficult. One cannot display them in a museum, nor lock them up in a vault for safekeeping, nor pass it down in a will as an inheritance to future generations. How then can we preserve this intangible martial arts for prosperity? Customarily, such a traditional skill is passed down from elders to children, from masters to disciples, and from teachers to students. There is, however, room for scholars like myself to ensure the survival of such kinetic knowledge through a method of ethnographic notation. In other words, the careful observation, annotation, and description of the intangible cultural heritage. That is, in part, the goal of my chapter in this new traditional martial arts as cultural heritage book that is part of Unesco's Living Heritage series. I've been practicing Taekwondo for about 25 years. that is me on the far left side with the ginger hair. I was maybe 15 years old at that time. My brother is the one on the opposite end with the long dark hair, and another friend of us. At that time I was very insecure, had low self-esteem and very clumsy, but I've changed, and a big part of that was my martial arts practice. When I moved to Korea over a decade ago, I also took up Hapkido and then Taekyon. Almost immediately, I started to notice certain shared characteristics between the Korean martial arts I was practicing. I don't mean shared techniques, although there are similar techniques in these martial arts, but rather a shared way of moving, which is different from the way I noticed martial arts move from other countries. I also developed an interest in Korean traditional dance and attended numerous performances. Here too, I couldn't help seeing similarities in the way these Korean traditional dances were moving and similar movements in Korean martial arts I was practicing. To affirm my observation, I decided to not only be an observer of traditional dance, but also become a participant. And so I started taking dance lessons from the National Theatre of Korea. I also took lessons in Korean percussion, learning to play jangu, the Korean hourglass drum. My goal was to understand Korean traditional rhythms better. I combined my experiences and observations in these disciplines and then cross-referenced my findings with published works, and over the years I also did informal interviews with many Korean traditional dance choreographers, dancers, and martial arts instructors. While there are lots of divergence between different types of Korean traditional dances and different types of Korean traditional martial arts, it became apparent to me that these Korean movement disciplines shared specific concepts, patterns of movements, and kinetic principles that gave them a particular Korean flavor. In my chapter in the book, I discuss 7 kinetic characteristics of traditional Korean body culture, which I will share with you today. They are an erect posture or straight spine, 단전 breathing, gulshin, the Korean 3-beat rhythm, kinetic chaining, curved lines and motions, and counterbalanced motions. Although these characteristics are not always present in every movement, they are usually perceivable, and it is their synergy that gives these disciplines a recognizable Koreanness. And now I am going to ask you to participate in some dance movements with me. So I hope you won't feel too uncomfortable, but could you please stand up? Thank you for participating. I'm going to do a very simple exercise. You won't get tired at all. In fact, you might even feel more energized. So this movement is maybe one of the most basic movements that you will learn in Korean dance. Let's start by putting our feet together. And now bend your knees. So keep your knees together and bend your knees. Stay there. And now we're going to breathe in and rise up. And now we're going to exhale and go down. Again. And down. Once more. And down. Okay, now we're going to add a movement. We're going to lift the arms to the side to about 45 degrees when we go up. So make sure your arms are not stiff, don't flap, just very relaxing. As you breathe in, imagine your danjon, the energy center down here, is expanding, and that expanding energy is going into your arms and lifting your arms. And as you breathe out, the danjon is shrinking again and your arms go back. Okay, now we're going to add some extra movement. We're going to start with one hand in front and the other hand at the back. And then we're going to extend the arms as we breathe in. And then change your arms every time. 감사합니다. So this latter movement, those last three movements, if you understand that, you understand Korean body culture, I think. So starting with the first one, an erect posture. This one is maybe the most controversial one. Some Korean martial artists would disagree on this one, but I think it's an important one nonetheless. Traditional Korean dance and martial arts tend to keep a straight spine with the head, shoulders, and hips naturally aligned. This does not mean that the spine is stiff or rigid, so it's not like ballet dancing where it's very stiff. No, it's just naturally upright, but simply natural. In most Korean traditional dance, there are no swaying or gyrating of the hips. So there's no belly dancing in Korean dance. That is wrong. Okay? Because this is too sexual for conservative Confucian morals. Some dance movements may require the dancer to bend at the hips or maybe lean a little bit, but even so, the spine is generally kept straight. In the martial arts, it's the same. There's an erect posture, and this is related to good balance. Oh, I went one too far. Think of the folk martial art Taekyon. The primary goal of the game is to topple your opponent through foot sweeps and throws. A posture that is not erect and therefore unbalanced will result in one being toppled more easily. In traditional Korean wrestling, shilum, the posture is not upright because the players are physically connected to each other, bearing the weight into each other. However, while the body may be bent at the hips, the shilum players engage their core muscles and keep their spine straight rather than rounded. The next principle is danjon hohop, danjon breathing. Proper breathing is key to effective physical activity and is based on good posture. Hence, Korean traditional dance equates the hohop-son, or breath line, with the chokchu-son, or backbone line. Similarly, posture and breath go together in martial arts practice as well. Not only does a slouch posture adversely affect your balance, but it also inhibits proper breathing, which leads to unnecessarily muscular tension, premature exhaustion, and unfocused technique. Korean dance and martial arts emphasize danjon hohop, danjon breathing, which is a type of abdominal breathing focused on the danjon area. The danjon corresponds to the sacral chakra in the lower abdomen, below and behind the navel. An important notion in danjon breathing is that breathing happens from the danjon rather than from the lungs. Movement in both Korean traditional dance and traditional martial arts are activated through the breath and synchronized with the breath. In Korean traditional dance and martial arts, movements usually commence with an inhalation and concludes with an exhalation. Oh, my time is almost finished. Next, gulshin. A core characteristic of Korean body culture is something known as gulshin, which is an extension and elongation and contraction or shortening of the body. This occurs both subtly and overtly. The subtle expression of gulshin occurs through danjon breathing that causes the body to expand and the spine to lengthen. The overt expression occurs in the limbs through the extension and contraction of the joints, such as bending and flexing of the knees. This is known as ogumjil. Ogumjil takes advantage of the natural elastic quality of tendons to add a spring-like quality to the steps. One can see this in pumbalki, the basic stepping in Taekyon, or the bouncing steps in Taekwondo. This kind of knee motion is called ogumchum sometimes, or knee dance in Korean dance. And we also find okechum, shoulder dance. This results in the body going up and down, and it creates a type of vertical oscillation or a wave-like movement called mulgyeoljil sometimes, or hwaldung pado in one form of Taekwondo, also known as sine wave. This gulshin is not limited just to the knees. It can also occur in the shoulders, as I mentioned, and you see it also in shilim and hapkido through the pulling and pushing motions. That's part of that martial art. Let's move on to the Korean 3-beat rhythm. Korean traditional music generally follows a triple rhythm with a downbeat start and an upbeat cadence. There's usually a rising action with some suspension in the air, followed by a falling movement at the end. This basic movement we can see in the 3-beat rhythm in sine wave, in ITF Taekwondo. We see it in pumbalki, in Taekyon, and in some other movements as well. I'm going a little bit faster than I would have wanted to. Kinetic chaining, number 5, refers to the sequential flow of movement from one body part to the other, and that's what we did when we were moving our arms like this, kinetic chaining. This kinetic chaining is also part of the power generation of Korean martial arts, where the techniques often uncoils in a whip-like fashion from the floor or from the center of the body. Sometimes this is known as chejigjil, whipping motion, or balgyeong, which comes from a Chinese term fajin. Number 6, naturally curved lines. Koreans believe that naturally curved lines are beautiful. You all know this word gokseonmi, which is part of this Korean aesthetic. As a result of gumshil and okumjil, naturally curved lines are noticeable in the wave-like stepping in dance and taekwondo, and also the uncoiling of the techniques because of kinetic chaining in the martial arts in this kind of chejigjil, this whipping way of moving. Counterbalance motions is the last one here. In Korean traditional dance movements, it's always expressed in a balanced or rather counterbalanced way. As I showed you, when one hand comes to the front, the other hand goes to the back. It doesn't need to be just the arms, it could be counterbalanced with the hands and the feet. In Taekyon's pumbalki is often performed while doing hwalge hundulgi, waving the wings, or hwalge doligi, rotating the wings, rotating the arms. One hand is above, one hand is below. In the martial arts, these counterbalance motions have a practical function. First, as a literal counterbalance, for instance, in kicking, the arms are frequently brought in the opposite direction, as you can see in the top picture there from Taekyon, to counterbalance your momentum so you don't fall over. Or it could be part of the pulling hand, so grabbing somebody, pulling them and punching at the same time. In both dance and martial arts, this is often interpreted as umyang in a philosophical way. So these are, or there should be seven, the 7 principles: erect posture, Danjon breathing, Guljin and Ogumjil, which creates an up and down movement, kinetic chaining, naturally curved lines, and counterbalanced motions. There's a small cautionary tale in my chapter, which I will not go into much detail now, but you are free to read it. In my chapter, I continue to show how things are changing. Some forms of Taekwondo are losing their traditional body culture due to sporting rule changes and the inclusion of pop music, especially K-pop music rhythms. I end with a warning to traditional martial arts who are tempted to try and appeal to a younger audience by changing training practices and competition rules and incorporating K-pop music and urban dance. While such changes may make it more popular, and in Taekwondo this might be the case, it is also evolving away from traditional Korean body culture. Traditional martial arts that want to keep their traditional essence should be cautious of making changes for the sake of popularity, because in this attempt at popularization, they may lose the very characteristics that exemplify their traditional identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sanko Luis. You talked about the preserving Korean body culture in traditional dance and martial arts. Please give a big round of applause to Professor Sanko Luis. Next, we will have a discussion bringing together 2 presenters and the panelists, Sujin Kim, Hyun-kyung Lim, and Sanko Luis. And we will invite Sung-yong Park, who will serve as a moderator.
네, 시간이
Because of time constraint, I'd like to jump up to the discussion session because of time constraint. In the afternoon, I focused on traditional martial arts as an intangible cultural heritage and the release of book and the implications of intangible cultural heritage. Professor Sanko Luis delivered a very interesting subject through his presentation under the title of Preserving Korean Body Culture in Traditional Dance and Martial Arts. And he encouraged us to have some movement, which was very interesting. So, traditional Korean body characteristics was delivered through 7 major characteristics and how such characteristics are changing recently. So, his presentation was very meaningful and thoughtful in that regard. So, we invited 2 more discuss. In order of these discussions, I will give question. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Kim Soo-jin, a master in physical education at Gyeongbuk National University. Good to see you all. I am Kim Soo-jin. It's a great honor to be with all of you.
그리고 임현경
We have also the Professor Im Hyun-kyung. Good afternoon. I am the Master in Physical Education of Korea University. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy and delighted for the great presentation. Thank you. Thank you. And Professor Sanko Luis is also joining with us today.
Okay, I will give you the floor later. Okay. 그러면 우선 김수
Okay then, Master Kim Soo-jin, could you make the 5-minute comments? to give your brief ideas and the comments regarding the two presentations for the session. And regarding the publication ceremony, you can also have very broad ideas with us. I have also done a lot of the work in publishing very good books, though, but I have also reviewed the section Copper Era. And in terms of the intangible cultural heritage, the ways inducing the more attention and awareness among the youth towards the intangible cultural heritage, like, for example, Taekyon in Korea or Judo in Japan or Yusu in China. Actually, the traditional martial arts are facing some challenges to be preserved. As I learned from the childhood, I also learned mainly about the techniques, but nowadays probably the trainings or the classes will be still transforming and inducing the youth and the children to get the more attention and more interest rather than just the techniques and skills only. So I believe that we also need to consider some of the different aspects, or in other countries like the China or Japan or Capoeira. I'm sure that the ways for the Korean context are to be also considered to preserve the traditional martial arts to be continuously maintained. I'd like to also get some of the comments or any. First of all, I believe that after listening to all the comments, let me give the opportunities for you to give the questions, because whenever reviewing some of the academic papers in the Living Heritage series, I have encountered some of the limitations and the challenges for the further developing the intangible cultural heritage in Korea. Of course, we have a number of intangible cultural heritage, including traditional martial arts, but still there are a lot of concerns and challenges how to maintain, how to preserve such traditional martial arts. That was one of my curious concerns. And probably Professor Sanko Luis, as the practitioner and martial artist, will give the definite answer for that. But to consider your question or comments, like regarding the Living Heritage series, of course, that comments are also related. But I think that your question or your comment are very broad in that spectrum. It's not only focusing on the Living Heritage series, but the whole area of the intangible cultural heritage and traditional martial arts. That's why the UNESCO ICM is also organizing as one of the international organizations in the field. For example, for Taekwondo or Taekyon. And if you look at other cases in foreign countries, they have very well-established mechanisms to preserve the traditional martial arts that we can get some lessons from those other countries. In this regard, the relevant cases of the traditional martial arts, probably we could have more ideas and solutions to transmit or to develop those mechanisms for our versions domestically in Korea. Considering perspectives from the intangible cultural heritage, I think that one of the key points is that it's a challenge for the community. In fact, we need to actually keep and maintain and develop those intangible cultural heritage to other countries as well, around the world. I mean, we need to deepen more involvement and participation among the stakeholders so that we can really have living culture, heritage, and tradition to other people and generations as well. That's a matter of the transmitting and preserving those cultural heritage. But for communities, we need to strengthen the functions that can led by communities. We also need to continue to transmit the cultural heritages to next generations via the systematic mechanisms, as I guess So probably throughout the seminar today, we cannot really deliver all the detailed information and issues. But for other sessions, probably we can dip into those issues more in detail.
In 2013, I think it was, I went to Japan with Professor John Johnson, and we went to see a sumo wrestling festival, sumo championships. We paid very expensive tickets to sit towards the back. If you want to sit close to the stage, you cannot afford a ticket. Last year, I went to the Shilum festival around this time last year. The seating was mostly empty. There were a few people from the local town who went to see the Shilum players, and they were the competitors. It's such a big contrast between how Japanese view their traditional wrestling, sumo, and how Koreans view Shilum. And it really made me sad, because I think Shilum is a wonderful wrestling form, and there's no reason why it doesn't have to be as popular as sumo is in Japan. And I think part of the problem is that Koreans have embraced the Olympic Games too much. Sports in Korea that has Olympic status gets lots of attention and lots of money from the government. But these less known sports, the indigenous sports like Shilum, Taekyon, and so on, that do not have Olympic status are greatly neglected. And that is something that should probably change at the highest level. Something else I noticed when I was in Japan at this sumo wrestling championship was how the athletes were sponsored for each fight by really big companies. So even if they lose, it doesn't matter. They get this big check from a company, and it's advertising for that big company when a champion fights in their names. I think if we can encourage somehow big Korean companies, Samsung, LG, and so on, to also invest in Korean culture, Korean traditional indigenous sports, maybe then we can change it. We are using, or Korea is using K-pop and popular Korean culture, stars, musicians and actors and so on, to promote Korean culture outside of Korea. What would happen if we have BTS start practicing Shilum, even if it's just for an exhibition on TV? Suddenly Shilum would become something cool, something that young people would be interested in. Imagine Blackpink go train in a Taekyon class. Suddenly Taekyon would get some status. Oh, a big K-pop band is doing this. I think it's possible to change the mentality, because currently young people think these things are old-fashioned. But there are ways to make it cool and hip again, and hopefully somebody in government or one of the big entertainment companies are listening to this and take up the charge to make traditional Korean culture interesting to Korean people.
네, 굉장히 좋은 점을 이제 지적.
Thank you for your great insight. You made a comparison between Japanese wrestling sumo and Korean traditional serum. But generally speaking, traditional Korean martial arts are losing its popularity because we are Olympic-driven society. And the big companies are not willing to make a big investment in promoting the traditional Korean martial arts. So you pointed out such things, which is very significant. Then my question goes to Im Hyun-kyung, please.
For me, I have learning Taekwondo for the past 20 years. I also majored in Taekwondo. And regarding the transformations in Taekwondo, I have encountered a lot of the changes. Throughout the reading the Living Heritage series, I got a lot of interest in Taekwondo and Karate or Karate. And regarding Karate, and I also saw that the Karate is one of the origination of the Taekwondo. As I majored in Taekwondo, I thought that Taekwondo is the unique and the only sport in Korea. And also about Taekwondo, as Taekwondo evolves so rapidly, and as we see a lot of the good performances among Taekwondo players at the Olympic Games, I hope that there will be a lot of the further development in Taekwondo in the future. As I am more involved in Taekwondo over the time, I have seen some changes, which I feel also very sorry, but I also feel very grateful for those transformations in Taekwondo. I don't think that Taekwondo has only the things and characteristics as the traditional martial arts, but there will be more the opportunities leading to the more collaborations along with other areas as well. Thank you very much for your great comment. Actually, regarding the changes and transformations to new environments and circumstances, of course, we need to consider the commercialization, of course. But to the public, we need to also seek ways in making more appeals from the general public towards the traditional martial arts. Of course, this can be also positive aspects. And regarding the transformation in Taekwondo, as you just pointed out, of course, the Taekwondo as one of the demonstration team, they have done some the performances into other countries. This is one of the very major and very crucial diplomatic activities between Korea and other countries. And we see that a lot of the dynamics and beauty as well in Taekwondo. In fact, whenever the demonstration teams visited other countries, I think that the demonstration team is having a lot of impact to promote Korean culture to other countries as one of the new transformative characteristics which are to be continued to last for the future as well. So thank you very much for your great comment. And by taking this opportunity, as Professor Sanko Luis mentioned earlier, the physical culture is to be also maintained. And he also talked about the 7 characteristics of those transformations in the Korean context. And my question goes to Professor Sanko Luis.
Previously, you talked about some changes of 7 characteristics of Korean traditional body move. So maybe you didn't have much time to say it is right or wrong or pros and cons, but some traditional music was not used. Meanwhile, some pop song and pop music is introduced in dealing with this traditional martial art. I mean, like Taekwondo. So, would you speak a little bit more about this, the transition and transformation? And if I take some example from the perspective of intangible cultural heritage, actually, these days, it is widely, acknowledged by the international society. The intangible cultural heritage can be changed, and transformed, as time goes by. It's quite natural. But when it comes to the tangible cultural heritage, so they are still very stick to authenticity and original form and materials. But as for intangible cultural heritage and its safeguarding, we usually admit that that kind of transformation and change is possible and accommodated. So would you speak about that?
There's so much I want to say. Where shall I start? Let's start with the fact that modern or contemporary taekwondo is changing, and I refer here to Kugi or WT taekwondo. And the changes are twofold. The one is a change because of competition rules. Now, other people like Dr. Udo Munich has done a lot of work on this. And because of the changes in rules, the techniques are changing. And previously I mentioned this idea of a kinetic chain. So kinetic chain is where you start with, let's say, the bigger muscle group, the torso, the hips, and then the thigh muscle, and then the lower leg, and so on. So it snaps out like this, a whip type movement. And taekwondo has evolved this type of movement to create very strong kicking techniques. And that is something that made it very popular in the past because of the great power that taekwondo has been able to do. I remember when I started taekwondo, we were kind of very stiff in our blocking, just more like a karate way. And later on, it changed, and it's also more of a whipping type motion, the same as in Taekyon, this type of whipping motion. Okay, the rules has changed. Now there's the PSS, the point scoring system, and because of that, you don't need this lots of power generation anymore. You just need to touch it effectively, and then it scores. So what's happened is taekwondo kicks has lost that original kinetic chain that was part of Korean culture, that the Korean traditional way of moving is with this kinetic chain. Now you don't need that. So that's the one example of how it's changing. The other example is what you see at Kugiwan performances, where they are including pop music, specifically K-pop music. Now we have to remember, where does K-pop come from? Now, what was that singer's name? So Taeji and the Boys, is that the right name? Okay, that's where it comes from. It's the introduction of hip-hop music from America to Korea. Where does hip-hop music come from? Hip-hop music is based on African rhythms, which we can call syncopated rhythms. So the rhythmic DNA of hip-hop music, which is now part of K-pop music, is completely different from the traditional 3-beat rhythm of traditional Korean music. Now, if you do a martial art and you change the rhythm, you change the martial art completely. It's something very different. Karate uses a 2-beat rhythm. Taekyon uses a 3-beat rhythm. If you force Taekyon to do a 2-beat rhythm, it will not be Taekyon anymore. If you change the rhythm of the martial art, it changes, and that is what's happening in Taekwondo, modern contemporary Taekwondo as well. Now the thing is, maybe this is okay for Taekwondo, because Taekwondo has always been an evolving martial art, and Taekwondo, modern or contemporary Taekwondo, is now in line with K-pop. K-pop is modern Korean culture. Taekwondo seems to follow that same line. But if we want to talk about a traditional martial art and we want to keep a traditional heritage, we cannot be changing the rhythms. We cannot change rules that will change the kinetic characteristics of the martial art. So it depends what your goal is. If your goal is for it to be contemporary, in line with contemporary Korean culture, that's fine. Then Taekwondo is doing the right thing. If your goal is to preserve a traditional or historic way of moving, you cannot do that. So Taekyon or other traditional martial arts should be very careful. It's my opinion. Be very careful how you change for the sake of popularity, because whenever you do that change, you are changing the essence.
네, thank you. 그러니까 사실
So to be honest with you, so there's an issue with tradition, change, and how to apply such changes, and how to strike the right balance between such changes. So this is a very time-honored question.
Korea, in more than 10 years ago, trotte was not popular amongst young people. Last night I was watching TV and trotte has made a comeback. Young people are singing trot and they partake in trot competitions and so on. It is possible to make old things interesting and popular again.
네, 그리고 뭐 그것도 그렇지만은
Yes, I agree with you. So some people play taekwondo and sing trot at the same time. So there is a correlation between taekwondo and trot, maybe in terms of rhythm and entertainment and promoting health. So maybe there are some benefits coming out of such collaboration. So let me go back to our original theme. So we have the issue of preserving tradition. However, through changes, to what extent should we embrace such change? So Professor Sanko told us that something should remain unchangeable with our own principle in place. So we need to reach a consensus in that regard. In terms of intangible culture heritage, of course, it is changeable. Traditional music, traditional dancing are evolving with the passage of time. So what our ancestors used to teach can change. However, if you say it shouldn't change, it would become a fossil. So when time passes by, something is supposed to change. So in response to such change, a community in charge of such area can play a certain role, whether it would be traditional martial arts or traditional dancing. So the community needs to play a central role in promoting to what extent we can embrace such change. So that was my point. So I and Professor Sanko delivered presentation, and we had a discussion talking about how Taekwondo promotes convergence and how we can revitalize traditional martial arts. And Professor Sanko delivered a key input. So my appreciation goes to Kim Soo-jin, Im Hyun-kyung, and Sanko Luis for your insights. Please give a big hand to all the discussants. Thank you. Let me conclude.